Welcome to the fourth of our catch-ups from Hebrews. As we've been having home meeting this week, it's been great to have had the opportunity to get outside again in our small groups. But this week we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 5, verse 11 through 14, and then all of chapter 6. And in this, we're a little bit different because the better this week is that the writer is expecting better things of the listeners than what he's perhaps seeing. We've said already that the book of Hebrews is a book reaching out to people who have been racing on with the Lord and then begun to pull back into the things of their old tradition, pulling back into the things of their old life. And the writer is calling them, look again at what's going on. And he said at the beginning, and let's just read a little chapters in. There's much that I could write about, but it's difficult to explain the truths to those who are not ready to learn. Really, by now, you should be teachers of the truth, yet you still need someone to teach you the basic truths of God's word again and again. You're like infants feeding on milk and not ready for solid food. Spiritual infants are not familiar with God's teaching about living in righteousness. No, it's only the spiritually mature who can take solid food, those who have learned for themselves to distinguish between what is good and what is evil in God's sight. He's speaking to a group of people who have been, or they may have been walking with the Lord for 5, 10, even 40 or 50 years, but they haven't yet grasped that it is living in God's righteousness and in his truth and falling back into the ways of their old lives. Tradition is so easy to pull us. And he's saying that I don't want to have to lay again those foundations. And this little passage is so helpful because actually, when we look at that, we see the foundations of our faith laid out so clearly. Beginning in chapter 6, it's a time to move from the basic teachings about Christ to more mature understanding of God's purposes. We should not have to lay again for you the foundation of truth that you need to turn away permanently from acts that lead to spiritual death. Nor should we have to keep reminding you to put your faith in God. And you should not need continual instructions about baptisms, about laying on of hands. Now that you know about the resurrection from the dead and eternal judgment to all men that is to come, so that by God's grace we can move you on in your understanding of his purposes. The writer's just laid out those basic doctrines. He laid out, actually, if you're going to come on, you need to not just have these knowing, but you should be living what it is to be living a new life, and so that you can move on to a place of righteousness. And then he swings it round because he's talking to those that have given up. He's speaking about those that have walked in the fullness of all that God has for them, those that have tasted the life of the Spirit, those who have walked flowing in him and yet have become cold in their faith and have begun to think, well, I can add this and I can add that. I need to be doing, and actually start replacing the life that they had with the stagnation of tradition and the whole place of just going through the motions, knowing about God but not knowing him truly. And he said, actually, there's a real issue here, because he says you must realize that it's not possible for those who have received the revelation of the truth, who have tasted the joy of the heavenly salvation, who have shared in the life of the Spirit, who know that God's word is good and true, who are aware of the power God will release in the age to come, to be brought back to unity with God if they've denied all they have known and experienced it. To deny what they know is to be true, is to be guilty of the equivalent of nailing God's Son to the cross again, subjecting him to public disgrace and ridicule. It's not a time for pointing fingers at other people and say, what about them? What about them? It's time for us to look at ourselves and make sure that we are living in the fullness of the revelation that we have. God has given us a revelation of what it is to live in his Spirit, to know the power of his resurrection. And we are called to be people who are walking in it. Let's not ever think that we can, I put my hand up and that's it, I'm there forever. We need to be people who are racing on to the line. And the writer says, I actually expect better things of you. I don't want to label you as being those that have failed. Just take this opportunity, take the call to be straightened up and to be running the race again. It says in verse 9, dear friends, these are uncomfortable truths of which we speak. However, we are confident that you will not deny what you know to be the truth and remain steadfast in your faith and live in the good of your salvation. We need to be people who are living in the good of our salvation, living in the wholeness of it. He goes on to say that we can't accuse God of being unfair, not being just. God made a promise to Abraham. He made a promise and he made it based on two things. He made an oath. And it says there that you can't make an oath on something that's greater than himself. But he made it on two things that would never change. He made an oath on his word and his name. God made it all true. He said, I'm going to do this. If you walk in my ways, I will make a way. I have done that through Christ. You cannot call back. And in verse 12, we do not want you to be spiritually lazy, but rather live like those who inherit what is promised because they persevere patiently in their faith. We're called to persevere. You know, it may be difficult. There may be challenges. There may be stuff that we'd rather not be going through. I think we all have things we'd rather not be going through. But actually, we're called to persevere because if we persevere, we meet our part of the bargain. We meet our part of the covenant, running that race to the end, running that race full of righteousness, full of love, full of life. God has said, I'm not going to fail you. I'm not going to leave you out. And so we read in verse 19 and 20, we have left behind the deceptiveness of the world and have taken hold of the sure and certain hope of what lies ahead. And this should cause us to be greatly encouraged. The hope of what awaits us in the future, a firm anchor to our souls. The truth keeps us secure and means that we have access directly into the Holy of Holies, God's very presence. We can pass through the curtain that was torn apart when Jesus went through death into his glory of the resurrection. He did all this on our behalf as high priest, an eternal high priest in the line of Melchizedek. Jesus has made the way. He tore the curtain from top to bottom that gave us access into the very presence of God. That presence that an earthly high priest could only access once a year, and we're going to go again into that. But Jesus is a high priest in the order of Melchizedek. What he has done, his sacrifice, is never ending. He has given us access to our Father. He's given access to the God of heavens. Why would we ever want to pull back from what we know to be true when he has done so much for us? Continue walking in his ways. We'll catch up next week with how we move on as we look at the next chapter in Hebrews. See you then.